com a música era mais divertido. Muito boa tarde, meu nome é André Tavares, sou programador da Garagem Sul e é com grande prazer que vos acolho aqui hoje e também ao Oliver Wainwright. As Conferências da Garagem têm sido um momento muito especial para a Garagem, trazer a Lisboa arquitetos e pensadores, poderíamos dizer assim, e neste caso em particular comunicadores do que é a arquitetura contemporânea e de como pode transformar-se e como a partir do pensamento e do exercício da crítica conseguimos pensar, repensar e equacionar a prática de projeto e a maneira como encaramos a arquitetura. O Oliver Wainwright devem talvez conhecê-lo sobretudo pela presença regular no Guardian como crítico de arquitetura desde 2012. É arquiteto e nesse contexto tem demonstrado que é possível fazer uma crítica acutilante, não só apologética, mas também propositor, ou como é dizer, capaz de sugerir como que a partir da crítica e do olhar para a arquitetura contemporânea conseguimos ou poderemos pensar a cidade, não só através da arquitetura, mas também e sobretudo através da relação da arquitetura com a sociedade. Nesta série de conferências, ele vai ser seguido pela Samia Eni, que cá virá no dia 21 de maio, e a Samia é uma novíssima investigadora e arquiteta que tem trabalhado sobre e que publicou um livro, Arquitetura da Contra-Revolução, que tem trabalhado sobre a presença dos arquitetos franceses na Argélia no momento da guerra na Argélia e, portanto, mostrando como é que os arquitetos, neste caso do lado mau da fita, poderíamos dizer assim, contribuíram para as políticas de repressão dos movimentos de libertação da Argélia do domínio francês. E vamos concluir esta série de 4 conferências de 2019 em 25 de junho com a Catherine Mosbach, que é paisagista francesa e que talvez a obra mais que nos seja mais que nos evoque ou que nós somos capazes de nos ter cruzado com ela em publicações mais próxima é o paisagismo do Louvre de Lens, que conhecemos da obra da Kazuo Sejima, e que traz também às Conferências da Garagem essa dimensão do paisagismo e de uma arquitetura que não se restringe exclusivamente à construção do edifício e pensa sobre o território e sobre a paisagem. E é particularmente nesse domínio que temos o prazer de hoje mostrar como é que no interior da Coreia do Norte se vive e como é que a arquitetura tem um capital e um poder simbólico extremamente potente e capaz de também elaborar pontes especiais entre a sociedade e a sua própria representação social. Não vos vou amassar mais com esta apresentação e queria mais uma vez agradecer ao Oliver a disponibilidade para estar cá. No final teremos algum tempo para perguntas e para troca de impressões. So Oliver, I was just promising them that they will learn everything that they need to know about architecture this evening, and we are very happy to welcome you here in the Garage Lectures. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andre. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for coming out here this evening. I trust you were saying nice things in your introduction, so thank you. So yeah, I've come to talk about the architecture of North Korea. I'm the architecture critic of The Guardian, and I suppose my job takes me to some pretty strange locations. But when I pitched the idea of an article on North Korea to my editor, his face fell. So if you want to go to North Korea, you're not going on behalf of The Guardian, you're going on your own. So that's exactly what I did. I just wanted to start with a kind of recent bit of news. So the book itself actually came out in September, and I had an exhibition in South Korea a few months ago in a city called Paju. And Paju is just a few miles from the border with North Korea. And the gallery where we had this exhibition, you could actually go up onto the roof and look through binoculars across to North Korea. And it's fascinating to see the reaction of South Koreans to these images, because to many of them it was the first time they'd had a chance to see what North Korea looked like. And so many of them said, it all looks so clean and so organized. You know, we wish Seoul had some of the order of Pyongyang, which I was quite shocked to see that reaction. But the city architect of Seoul, a guy called Sung Yo-sang, came to the exhibition, and he actually said, given the newly kind of warm relations between North and South, architecture has become a relatively neutral area in which the two sides can begin to discuss and collaborate. And so they actually moved the exhibition of my photos to Seoul City Hall, and it's the first time they told me that anything to do with North Korea has been hosted in the government building in Seoul. So it's just fascinating for me to see how architecture has become this kind of tool of diplomacy. It's a subject on which the two sides can begin to exchange. And actually the forthcoming Seoul Architecture Biennale, there's going to be a whole exhibition which is a kind of collaboration between the North and the South. So we'll see how that goes. So in terms of where my interest was first sparked in North Korea, maybe some of you were there. This was the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, where the Korean pavilion for the first time actually showed the work of North and South Korean architects together. The pavilion itself was designed in the 1990s, and the idea was always that it would host the work of North Korea alongside South Korea. But obviously that never happened because Kim Il-sung died, and the diplomatic situation was, no communication between the two sides. So in 2014, it was the first time that the work of North Korean architects had been shown. Now, what was fascinating to me is that the brief to the North Korean architects was imagine what the future of tourism might look like in North Korea. What kinds of structures will you be dreaming up to host the forthcoming hordes of tourists? And this was what they'd imagined, these kind of conical mirror glass hotels on columns topped with windmills. Cantilevered treehouse hotels in the forests with an air of a kind of neo-Frank Lloyd Wright. Flying hovership hotels, which would have had an interior worthy of Miss Moneypenny from the Thunderbirds, this kind of retro sci-fi aesthetic, which I found fascinating. Bridges that almost seemed to emulate Norman Foster's Millau Viaduct crossing the valleys of North Korea. And futuristic hotels shaped like water wheels that would all be powered by solar panels. So these were paintings made that year, 2013, 2014, by North Korean architects, imagining what the future of the country might look like. And they've been curated by this guy, Nick Bonner, who was actually a British landscape architect who moved to Beijing in the 1980s, and he was one of the first Westerners to start taking groups of tourists into North Korea. And what really surprised me is that he said to me, if you think these images are crazy, you'll be amazed to learn that they're not too different from what they're actually building in Pyongyang right now. And I wasn't quite sure if he was joking. But then I saw this image. This is Kim Jong-un inspecting the latest orphanage in the city of Wonsan, which is on the coast in the north. And I kind of thought maybe he wasn't joking. Maybe this is the kind of architecture they're dreaming up. So I decided to go and see it for myself. I signed up for the first architectural tour that Coreia Tours was running. Coreia is the company set up by Nick Bonner in the 1990s. And I spent about 10 days on a kind of whirlwind tour of North Korean architecture. And I realized that if I went as a tourist, this is me in tourist mode, I would actually have much more access to sites in North Korea than if I'd gone as a journalist. So several of my Guardian colleagues had gone in official capacity to report about North Korea. And they described this very stage-managed process where you're flown into the country for 48 hours and you're taken to one particular site, usually a kind of missile launch site, and then you're flown out of the country. And I realized that going on a kind of package holiday, essentially, which is what I did, I would have access to many more sites than if I'd gone as a journalist. So just some first impressions of Pyongyang. I think the thing that strikes you the most when you're standing at the top of the tower of the Juche idea is quite how colorful the city is. I mean, my kind of preconception as an outsider was that Pyongyang would be a place of monotonous gray concrete apartment blocks marching for miles, a kind of George Orwell 1984 dystopian vision. But instead, the buildings are painted in shades of terracotta, baby blue, pink, this kind of minty green. And then you have specific kind of iconic moments of architectural expression. In the distance, we've got the silvery petals of the May Day Stadium built for the 1989 World Festival of Youth and Students. This is the Central Youth Hall, whose undulating metal shell is designed to look like a kind of armadillo. This building had just been completed the year before my visit, which is North Korea's first skate park. So they had skate ramps, an indoor ice rink, all of these kind of new facilities for leisure. And the color scheme was something that kept recurring. The most common color palettes, I suppose, were this kind of terracotta-y salmon and this minty green. And I just want you to be looking out for this color palette because it keeps recurring again and again, and I'll explain later why I think those colors are so popular. Here they're demonstrated in the youth hall, which has the trademark palette of the kind of pinks, pale blues, and greens. This was built in 1963. So that's the first observation, the color. And I suppose the second observation is the fact that when you're walking around Pyongyang, it feels like going through a series of kind of stage sets, like opera, sets from a socialist realist opera, because every piece of the city has been designed as a kind of choreographed tableau, usually to focus your attention on one particular monument. This is the Workers' Party monument. Symmetrical buildings either side of this huge axis, which runs for 2 kilometers through the city. At the other end of the axis are the 20-meter-high bronze statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, allegedly the largest bronze statues in the world, but no one's ever been able to verify that because you're not allowed to touch them. And they look suspiciously like fiberglass to me. Either side of those statues, you have 2 40-meter-long red marble flags held aloft by bronze statues of triumphant workers and revolutionary soldiers, tying this piece of the city into one immutable whole. Now, a brief potted history of Pyongyang. At the end of the Korean War in 1953, this is what the city looked like. It was almost entirely destroyed. The Koreans say that 350,000 bombs were dropped on a city which at the time had a population of 300,000, just to give you an idea of the level of destruction. Only 3 buildings really survived from that time. Now, when Kim Il-sung came to power, he saw it as an opportunity to lay out his kind of ideal city plan. And he turned to the Moscow-trained architect Kim Jong-hui, who actually, anyone who knows Moscow, this will seem very familiar. It's a very similar kind of plan with concentric boulevards, long axes connecting key public spaces, vistas terminating in great monuments, whether they're cultural buildings or statues of the leaders. And these are the kinds of kind of political spaces that master plan created. This is Kim Il-sung Square on one side of the Taedong River, the Grand People's Study House, which is the central library, being at one end of the axis. Again, another monumental axis that crosses the river, and terminates in the Tower of the Juche idea, which is another, it's just showing you where it is in the city. And these aren't public spaces in the sense that we think of public spaces in Europe. I mean, they're political spaces for grand displays of kind of patriotic fervor. We were there a few days before National Day and saw the students rehearsing for their great performance. I just wanted to say a bit about the kind of ideology behind the city, because as well as it being a very political structure, a lot of it was driven by actually kind of garden city ideology, so dating back to Ebenezer Howard and the garden city movement in the UK. Kim Il-sung described Pyongyang as a great garden of Juche architecture, Juche being the national North Korean ideology, and actually set this as a specific piece of urban planning guidance that only 25% of the city's area could be devoted to buildings, and the rest would be either green or public space. So it does have a kind of campus-like feel. They haven't quite stuck to the 25% rule, but it is a very green city. Again, when you're standing at the top of the Juche Tower, you see this kind of green riverside promenade. The kind of center of the city is actually quite lush. There's parks where we saw families having picnics and kind of couples strolling of an evening. There's over 30 public parks in Pyongyang, and if you divide the amount of green space per capita, there's 40 square meters of green space per resident in Pyongyang compared to just 16 square meters in Seoul. So that's one thing the city has going for it. Now, a bit about the architecture of the early years. This is the Moranbong Theatre, built in 1954, so one of the first kind of state-led projects. What's particularly interesting about it is that it shows, I suppose, the Soviet influence. In a way, it looks like much of the puffed-up Stalinist neoclassicism familiar from the Soviet Union, but it has very specific Korean characteristics. So I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting, but the kind of classical frontage, it's actually octagonal columns, which refers to the ancient Korean temples of the kind of Goryeo dynasty that all had these octagonal columns, and then the overhanging giwa, which is the green tiled rooftop. So it's taking neoclassicism and explicitly making it Korean. They were emphatic about having these Korean characteristics to tie the Kim dynasty into the kind of lineage of Korean dynasties, from the Goryeo to the Joseon to the Kim, and architecture was one of the tools to kind of legitimize this new regime. This is the Taedongmun Cinema, built in 1955, which again follows that pattern of a kind of Stalinist neoclassicism with Korean characteristics. Again, you can see the octagonal columns. And the hostess. So each building we visited, we were greeted by a very well-briefed hostess dressed in the national costume of the Joseon Ot. And they would kind of religiously recount the statistics of the building, exactly its dimensions, the number of people it could hold, crucially how long it took to build. They're always very proud of how quickly these buildings were erected. This only took 9 months from start to finish. But the most crucial fact of all was always framed in gold and red above the entrance. And it stated how many times the leaders had visited the building. So I'm sorry that the image is cut off, but it's how many times Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il set foot in this building. And it's a kind of leader worship that continues today. When you visit a new leisure building or university building, which Kim Jong-un has unveiled, they often keep the chair which he sat in framed in a kind of perspex box in the entrance. So the veneration continues. So this is the Grand People's Study House, built in the 1980s as the central library. It contains 600 rooms with capacity for 30 million books and up to 12,000 visitors a day. It was imagined as the architectural axis of the city. And I think what was interesting about it is the kind of omnipresence of the leader in every single room. So you go into the main entrance, you have a marble statue of Kim Il-sung in the kind of Abraham Lincoln pose, sitting on his chair in front of Mount Paektu. This is a mosaic of Mount Paektu, which is the kind of holy mountain in North Korea, where legend has it that Kim Jong-il was born and winter suddenly changed to spring, and a double rainbow appeared. And then you go into the main reading room, and again, you have the portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il looking down on you. They're there in the internet room, which is strictly limited to the North Korean national intranet. They're also there in the other computer room. They're looking down on you at the book lending desk. And it was a part of the kind of architectural criteria of every public building. The leader's image must always be placed in the center of the architectural space. Now, the Kims, they really kind of understood the power of architecture in cementing this personality cult. So they were often photographed kind of looking at models, poring over plans. And Kim Jong-il, I think he's one of the few dictators to have taken architecture seriously. He wrote a 160-page treatise on his architectural principles, which reads like a kind of mashup of every architectural manifesto ever written. It's got bits of Corbusier's Vers une architecture, it's got bits of Frank Lloyd Wright, bits of Ruskin, all kind of mashed together and suffused with Korean characteristics. I recommend it if anyone has insomnia. It's a very good cure. And it kind of emphasizes again and again how the leaders must be ever present. They're looking out over the public spaces, they're in the entrance to every hotel, they're at the end of every metro platform, often covered in gold. And the interesting thing is, when you don't see the leaders' image themselves, you see their flowers. So there are two national flowers, the Kim Jong-ilia and the Kim Il-sungya. I think this is the Kim Il-sungya, let me get this right. Yes, this is the Kim Il-sungya, the violet orchid. Not to be confused with the Kim Jong-ilia, which is a scarlet begonia. And they're everywhere. You know, in places in a Western city where you would have billboards advertising the latest products, instead you have the Kim Jong-ilia and the Kim Il-sungya on the tops of apartment buildings, on the roadside, at the entrance to the metro stations. So it's kind of reinforcing the personality cult everywhere you go, even if it's not in the form of the portraits themselves. And there are great stories, actually, of kind of loyal North Koreans who would sacrifice their own central heating in order to keep their flowers alive. And when you go through Pyongyang, you see on most of the balconies, people have a little display of the Kim Jong-ilia and the Kim Il-sungya to show their loyalty to the leaders. So it has become a kind of national cult. One of the other key principles expounded in Kim Jong-il's manifesto is about monuments. And he states that the magnificence of grand monuments is expressed through unusually large size and vast numerical quantity. And Pyongyang is the ultimate example of that. So here we have the Arch of Triumph, not to be confused with the Arc De Triomphe. Obviously modeled on the arch in Paris, but 10 meters taller because of the stack of 3 rooftops that's been bolted onto the top. It was built to mark Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday, and accordingly it is clad with 25,550 slabs of stone, representing the number of days of Kim Il-sung's life on his 70th birthday. The numerology, all of these monuments have numerological aspects, whether it's their height, the number of pieces of stone. It's the same with the Tower of the Juche idea, which was also built for Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday, also clad with 25,550 slabs of granite, topped with a 45-ton red glass frame, and rises to 170 meters, which is crucial because that makes it 1 meter taller than the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., which is something that Kim Jong-il insisted on. When the architects submitted this idea in the competition, it was maybe 2/3 of the height, and he realized that it wouldn't be quite as tall as the one in Washington, so beefed it up in order to beat D.C. These are the statues of the workers, which stand at the bottom of the tower, and just to give you an idea of the scale, that is a human being. So they're, again, more than 20 meters high, allegedly made of bronze. The Workers' Party monument, built in 1995 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party. And again, it has the hammer and sickle, which are familiar symbols of every communist regime around the world. And what marks out the North Korean Workers' Party is the addition of the intellectual's calligraphy brush. Because as well as embracing the manual laborer and the agricultural laborer, Kim Il-sung was very explicit about also embracing the intellectual, which is something that makes North Korean communism slightly different. This is the Arch of Unification, built in 2001 to commemorate Kim Jong-il's three-point charter for national reunification, which crosses the famous Unification Highway, which is the central road that connects the north with Kaesong, which is the closest city to the border. Now, again, when you ask any North Korean, so, which side is North Korea and which is South, they say, no, you've missed the point, because Korea is one. They're both the same. And it's fascinating, the narrative I went to the border from both sides, and on the north, they describe Korea as one country, the southern half of which is under occupation by the Americans. So they don't talk about South Korea as the enemy in the way that the South has always. It's this much more plaintive narrative of one country that's been severed by outside forces. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about the metro, because to be honest, it's one of the most incredible aspects to Pyongyang. Anyone who's been to Moscow will appreciate, when metro stations are designed like palatial ballrooms. But explicitly, it was designed as a tool of ideological education. Built between 1965 and 1987, it has 16 stations in total. It's one of the deepest metro systems in the world, built at a level of 110 meters below ground, because the stations themselves double up as nuclear bomb shelters. So when you go through the entrance, you see these enormously thick steel doors that can be slid shut at a moment's notice. This is Yongwan Station, which means Glory Station, built in 1987 with chandeliers designed to recall the fireworks of victory celebrations, and the columns themselves designed to be victorious flaming torches. This is the Golden Field Station, designed to celebrate the bountiful harvests of North Korea. So we see Kim Il-sung depicted in a field of wheat, hand-blown glass chandeliers modeled on bunches of grapes. Again, all of the kind of mosaics on the platforms are designed to celebrate aspects of agriculture or industry. So you have these very prosaic scenes, but held aloft as kind of monumental triumphs. This is the Three Revolutions Station, which celebrates the achievements of scientists and gymnasts. Now, 1989 was a key year in the kind of evolution of Pyongyang, because it's when the city hosted its most kind of spectacular international event to date, which was the World Festival of Youth and Students, which is a kind of Olympic Games for communist countries. It was hosted 1 year after Seoul hosted the Summer Olympics, no coincidence there, and it saw 177 different countries visit Pyongyang, including a delegation of 100 athletes from the United States. Now, Kim Il-sung saw this as a perfect opportunity to kind of show off the power of North Korea to international visitors. So it was treated as the deadline to build a huge number of trophy projects all around the city, including a huge amount of housing. So this is Kwangbok Street, built for the World Festival, which is a 4-kilometer-long boulevard of apartment buildings for up to 20,000 families, down which all of the athletes would be forced to process, just to kind of reinforce the power of North Korean construction on either side. And it was a project that Kim Jong-il took personal interest in, because he described it as a kind of laboratory where the future of North Korean architecture could be shown off. And what he was most interested by was the three-dimensional nature of the street. So he said, to ensure variety in the formation of a street, the street must be formed in 3 dimensions. He explicitly said orthogonal buildings are a symbol of the past. We must be designing apartments in the shape of cylinders, in ziggurats, in S-shaped curves. And he got very into the specific geometry of these kind of mass housing units, which obviously all had to rely on fairly basic concrete construction, which prompted the architects to go for a kind of formal experimentation in the way that they might not have done if they'd had access to other kinds of materials. So the limitations of construction have actually spawned quite an expressive style of architecture, whether they're hexagonal, cylindrical, ziggurat-shaped. And they were published widely at the time. These are the plan layouts and photographs of Kwangbok Street. Another one of Kim Jong-il's key principles was the Koreanness. So as well as being kind of national on the one hand, they should also be modern. He got very paranoid about this idea of the outside world superseding what Korea was doing. So as well as being nationalistic, things had to kind of keep up with the outside world. And so they designed this entire campus of sports facilities for 1989 called Chongchun Sports Street, where the weightlifting arena was actually designed in the shape of a pair of dumbbells, like weights, and the badminton arena had a roof that followed the arc of a flying shuttlecock. So quite, from this period, actually fairly expressionist and bold works, which have recently undergone some quite interesting renovations. So this is the interior of the basketball stadium, which about a year before my visit was redone in what now turns out to be the kind of national color scheme of salmon and teal. This is the Pyongyang ice rink, again built for the World Festival of Youth and Students, apparently modeled on a skater's cap. That's what the guide told us. I have suspicions that it might be modeled on Frederick Gibbard's Cathedral in Liverpool, or possibly even influenced by Oscar Niemeyer's work. But obviously no outside influence is acknowledged in North Korea. Everything comes from Korea itself. This was the Rungrado May Day Stadium, also built for the festival, which is allegedly still the largest stadium in the world, with a capacity of 114,000 people. Depending on which guide you ask, it's either designed to resemble the unfurling petals of a magnolia flower, or a parachute which has just come into land. So you can choose whichever image you prefer. Now, again, this had just been renovated a few weeks before our visit. So this is just to show you the scale. Again, the size of a guard at the bottom there. Great structural legs like the feet of the Eiffel Tower coming down to land. So it had just undergone renovation. It had always been used to host the mass games, which is this kind of gymnastics spectacular where they form images of the leaders and of great patriotic slogans. But when Kim Jong-un came to power, there were hopes of hosting international events like the Olympics and the World Cup. So the entire thing was redone with a FIFA standard football pitch, an Olympic standard athletics track, and these incredible ancillary rooms, which to me had the surreal quality of a cross between a kind of Wes Anderson set or a Thomas Demand paper sculpture. This incredibly kind of flat, pristine quality, again with the characteristic color scheme that we've seen so many times already. This was the physiotherapy room with a gold banquette, the FIFA strategy room. And again, at the time, it's easy to dismiss these things as stage sets for tourists. It's a fake FIFA logo which they've just stuck on the wall to impress outsiders. When I got back, I realized it was all funded by FIFA. The entire renovation of the May Day Stadium was paid for by FIFA, and they just managed to allocate the funding before international sanctions were put in place. And it was announced just a couple of months ago that South Korea and North Korea are going to be putting in a joint bid for the 2032 Olympic Games. So this building is suddenly taking on a new relevance as a kind of diplomatic symbol. It's where President Moon gave his speech when he came to North Korea. It's where South Korean pop groups have performed recently. So there's a kind of new hope invested in this structure. Now, just finally, I wanted to show a couple of my favorite buildings in Pyongyang. This is the Changwon Health and Recreation Complex, built in 1980 as the kind of flagship leisure center. It contains a sauna, bathhouse, swimming pools, and hair salons where customers can choose from a range of officially sanctioned haircuts. You come into the main entrance and you have this beautiful terrazzo floor, again featuring the Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung flowers, fluted marble columns, mosaic work on the swimming pool surround, a multi-leveled diving platform which actually had a mechanical elevator behind this smoked glass screen to take you to your desired platform so you could ascend with a certain level of modesty. This was the ladies' hair salon waiting room with the official haircuts to choose from. And the salon itself unchanged since the 1980s. And the second building was the Coreia Hotel, which is actually where we stayed. This building, the Twin Towers, built in 1985 as the kind of showcase hotel for foreign visitors with a total of 500 rooms. 2 towers with a bridge in between, the only problem being that one tower is for foreigners and the other tower is for North Koreans, and the two are never allowed to meet. So the bridge has always had a brick wall in the middle. This is the lobby of the hotel, the breakfast buffet, which again has this kind of Wes Anderson aesthetic. And both towers are topped with revolving restaurants, which is a recurring motif in Pyongyang. The famous Hotel of Doom, the Pyramid Hotel, was going to have 5 revolving restaurants on top, still awaiting opening. This is let me get the name right, the East Pyongyang Grand Theatre. I want to show this because it's a building that was actually quite contentious in our group. It was originally built in 1989, but had undergone renovation in 2007 when they'd added this kind of mirror glass frontage. And the entrance, which used to have a terrazzo floor similar to the leisure centre, beautiful parquet, wooden floors, and more mosaics on the walls. That had all been ripped out because it was deemed to be too reminiscent of the Soviet era when the country was still relying on outside help. And so the guide told us, oh yeah, no, we used to have this old wooden floor, it was so old-fashioned, we got rid of that and we replaced it with this modern vinyl, which is much more durable and much more easy to clean. So, I mean, this is the aesthetic of modern-day Pyongyang, and I just find it fascinating. It's this kind of strange hybrid. I mean, some of these spaces are very familiar. Anyone who's been to China, it's the very familiar aesthetic of kind of new hotels with the halogen lights and the glossy granite floors. But again, we're seeing these complementary color schemes of kind of opposite sides of the color wheel being used together. And everyone kept asking me about these pictures, why does North Korea have such a specific color scheme? And it's a question that I kept asking the guides, like, what is it with these pastel combinations? And they never had an answer. And it was only after kind of, looking at these pictures for longer that I realized it's something that's been part of kind of Korean aesthetics for centuries. So the traditional hanbok costume, known as the Joseon-ot in North Korea, it often pairs complementary colors. So you'll have a pink dress with a turquoise jacket, and they're exactly the same kinds of colors that have been recurring in the architecture. And if you go back even further, it's the same kinds of colors that you find in the temples of the Joseon dynasty. I mean, these are actually in South Korea, but you find exactly the same color palettes in the north. And it all comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about the Kim dynasty kind of using aesthetics as a way of legitimizing their regime, keeping the same kinds of color schemes that have been around for centuries. Now, I just wanted to finish with what's been happening in the past few years, because it's taken a dramatic leap from what was happening under Kim Jong-il. This is Changjeon Street, which was unveiled in 2012 as the first kind of trophy project under Kim Jong-un. It was jokingly nicknamed Pyonghatan by foreign diplomats at the time, who dismissed it as a kind of PR stunt. It's, oh yeah, look, North Korea can do high-rise towers just like the rest of the world. But what's interesting to me is that actually every year since 2012, Kim Jong-un has unveiled another high-rise district. So these are apartments for professors at Kim Il-sung University, again shaped like an intellectual's calligraphy brush, these towers on the left. These are high-rise apartments for artists, spiraling blue balconies reminiscent of seaside rock candy. This was Future Scientist Street, which was actually under construction at the time of our visit and recently unveiled. again, shaped like a brush, if you look at the towers on the left. And Rumyong Street. I'm afraid this isn't one of my photographs because this was actually completed since my visit. Premier Pak Pong-ju announced that the completion of this street is more powerful than 100 nuclear warheads. So, they're using architecture and urban planning as this kind of showcase show of power on the international stage. 5,000 apartments in towers that rise up to 70 stories, and again, clad with minty green and orange tiles. One fascinating kind of glimpse behind the scenes was when we went to the Paektusan Architecture Academy, which is the central bureau where all of these projects are designed. Now, this is the entrance to the office where they have a mural of the city, and every time a new project is completed, they get out a ladder and paint the new development onto the scene. This is what the office actually looks like in reality, with guys poring over SketchUp and designing the interiors of the latest buildings. And then it suddenly dawned on me, maybe the real reason that all of the new interiors have these pastel complementary color palettes is that the table lamps in the office have subliminally influenced the interior design. But these are just some of the projects they were working on at the time. And again, you see these kind of candy colors, what I called kind of kindergarten kitsch, because I got the impression it was actually quite a strategic tool, and it's basically used by the state as a way of kind of infantilizing the population. If you can design everything with this saccharine, candy-coated kindergarten aesthetic, it keeps the population kind of at bay, infantilized in a way. And now, despite all of this talk about how nothing is influenced by the outside world, they actually had an entire gallery of foreign precedents. And it was interesting that everything in their precedent gallery had a kind of monumental, often symmetrical form. So we have the Great Pyramids, the temples at Petra, obviously the Seven Sisters in Moscow, some kind of expressionist and metabolist work. These are the buildings they're using as their inspiration when they're designing new projects. Interesting for anyone familiar with London that Terry Farrell's MI5 headquarters is one of their residents. That's the kind of spy base in the UK. And this is the product. This is what they're building at the moment. So all of the effort under Kim Jong-un is going into the infrastructure of leisure and pleasure. This was Munsu Water Park, which feels very much like any other Western water park, except for the fact that when you enter, you're greeted with a waxwork of Kim Jong-il, standing on a beach in front of which you must bow before you're allowed into the swimming pool. There's bike lanes now all around the city, freshly painted, although this detail made me wonder how seriously the bike lanes are actually being taken and how much they're being used. The first commercial billboards are starting to appear because car ownership has recently been allowed in a major change. This kind of emerging middle class in Pyongyang of a certain kind of elite grade are being allowed to buy their own cars. So Pyonghua Motors, which began as a collaboration between South Korea and North Korea, is finally being advertised around the city. And I said, just to conclude, I wanted to show a brief glimpse of the world outside Pyongyang, because it became very evident that the capital is a kind of bubble. It's a showcase city to show off these trophy projects to Westerners. And we had a few days outside Pyongyang on the way down to Kaesong, and this is the kind of average building that you see in the countryside. Cinder block construction, very kind of shoddily made, walls and floors not quite fitting together, and yet still painted in the national color palette of kind of complementary salmon and teal, even in the middle of the fields. So this is when we got down to the border, and I guess just to end on an optimistic note, anyone who reads Korean might be able to help me with this, but I believe it says, "Let's give united Korea to the future generations" on the left, and "Korea is one" on the right. So I think I will end there and invite questions, comments, and provocations. Thank you very much.
first question is always
yeah.
the hardest. And one of the things is the vision that you had was the one of a tourist. And how was the reaction of Koreans? I imagine that conversation was not very fluid. But how did it work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It was obviously a very stage managed visit and a very choreographed. They only show you the buildings they want to show you. So the thing we were really keen to see, which sadly we didn't get to see, was an average household, an average apartment, and that was on the itinerary. And then we were on our way there, and suddenly the bus driver took another turning and said, "Oh no, that visit won't be happening today." So there were things like that where certain parts of the itinerary got changed without any warning. Generally it was much more open, I suppose, than I was expecting. So we had 3 official guides with us at all times, but you were allowed a certain level of kind of flexibility. So as long as you remained within their eyesight, you could kind of wander down the streets, you could take photographs of pretty much anything you wanted. There were only 3 rules about photography. One was no construction sites. So actually the photo that I showed you was highly controversial. So forget that photo. Because they want everything to look finished. They don't want to ever show something in the process of being made. It has to look finished and perfect. The second rule was no photographs of military installations, which is fairly common practice anywhere in the world. Nowhere really likes you taking photographs of their military installations. And the third rule, which was interesting, was about photographing people, that you should just kind of ask their permission before putting a camera in their face, which again, I think is just kind of common courtesy. But it was explained to us that it's because they want to look their best, in a similar way to the architecture. They want everything to look finished and presentable, that if a North Korean person is being photographed, they want to be ready and be wearing the clothes that they're proud of. But apart from those 3 rules, we were given much more freedom and flexibility to photograph than I was expecting. And the guides themselves, you read these stories about robotic guides who only read from the official script, but they were much more normal and had a kind of proper sense of humor and actually a real interest in the outside world. So one of the guides took me aside at one point and said, "How did Michael Jackson die?" Because they hear rumors and they hear kind of fragments of news from the outside world, but they're really interested in pop culture, in fashion. I saw a kid wearing a Wayne Rooney football shirt on the metro. So I think you'd be surprised actually at the level of apparent normality. There were kids on rollerblades zooming around one of the public spaces. The women now wear high heels, sunglasses is quite a recent thing, fitted clothes, very colourful clothes, couples walking arm in arm along the riverside. It's really not as kind of, I think public life isn't as strictly managed as you might expect from the outside. That was one big surprise to me.
Thank you for the lecture. If you're there for 10 days, and I see the lecture, it seems that all your time was spent in daylight. During the day, a lot of pictures. I know there's some restrictions about nightlife activities to a certain degree. And what I was wondering is, does the city changes at night? Aspects of illumination. Is it standard dictatorial illumination kind of atmosphere, or could you tell a bit something about the nightlife?
Of course. The reason for the lack of any photographs by night is that we weren't allowed to have tripods. And so the few photographs that I do have taken at night are rather too blurry to publish. But it would have been useful to include some, because again, when you read reports of travel in Pyongyang from the kind of 1990s and the early 2000s, they talk about how it's totally black at night. They say the electricity gets switched off at 8 or 9 p.m. and the entire city is a void. And that's just not true anymore. It's as illuminated as probably like a second-tier Chinese city. So not quite on the level of Shanghai and Shenzhen, but it is still very brightly lit. So most of the towers that I was showing towards the end have LED lights included in their facade. The Great Pyramid Hotel, which stood as an empty concrete ruin on the skyline for years, was finally clad with mirror glass in a deal with an Egyptian telecoms company where they got to run the national intranet in exchange for providing the cladding for this building. And as part of that deal, there's an incredible light show where that pyramid becomes like a kind of Dubai-esque screen by night. Which, again, it was actually just switched on about 2 months after my visit, so I didn't see that for myself. But there's a lot more illumination than I think if you'd visited Pyongyang 10, 15 years ago. The other thing to mention about nightlife is the sound. So they still have this very eerie sound which comes from the central station. And I think it's every hour they broadcast this kind of patriotic song, and it echoes throughout the city, so all through the night. In the same way that in the West you have church bells every hour through the night, or in Muslim countries you have the call to prayer. In North Korea you have this patriotic anthem pumped out of the central station every hour, which is quite an eerie atmosphere. But we didn't get to experience much of it because as soon as you come back to the hotel, the doors are locked and you're not allowed out onto the street on your own without the accompaniment of the guides. So, yeah. Karaoke is also a very big part of North Korean nightlife. As you might expect, there are tons of karaoke bars and much beer being consumed.
Some more questions?
Hi, thank you very much for a great presentation. I was just curious about the process of getting into North Korea. I assume that it's not like taking a charter flight to North Korea like that. And as an extension of that, I'm wondering, because you talked in the beginning about their aspirations of kind of building a tourism sector, and how are they doing in that sense?
Great question. If you're not a journalist, it's actually very easy to go to North Korea. So there's now 5 companies, mostly based in Beijing, who organize these kind of package tours for foreigners. So I've become like a travel agent for North Korea because I keep saying to people, you have to go and see it for yourself. It's very easy. It's still relatively expensive. I think probably the cheapest tour you can do is maybe €1,000 or 900 euros, but that's for like a week of everything inclusive, so it's not insane. But yeah, there's an amazing airline called Air Coreia, which flies from Beijing directly to Pyongyang. That's one way of getting in. The other way is to get the overground train, which again goes from China, and you come in overland. All of these things have to be organized by one of the travel companies. It's still impossible to go as a kind of independent backpacker. But they have huge ambitions to boost tourism. I forget the exact statistic, but it's something like they want 5 million tourists by 2022 or something like that. And at the moment, they only have 5 or 10,000. So it's a huge aspiration to boost tourism. And they're building an insane amount of infrastructure. So one plan that we saw in the Paektusan Academy was for an underwater hotel to be built off the coast of Wonsan. They just completed the ski resort in Maksirong, again near Wonsan. There's a horse riding center north of Pyongyang, a huge number of kind of restaurants and bars and new hotels. So they're trying, and actually I think the main audience for tourism in North Korea is mainland China. And one of the most interesting things was actually seeing package holidays of Chinese people marveling at a place where communism is still intact. You know, they were kind of like telling their children, this is what it used to be like. Because it's very, I really believe that it's following the trajectory of China, but probably 20 or 30 years behind. So that it's making very similar moves of kind of keeping the political structure and mechanisms intact, but tacitly allowing a kind of free market to develop. So it's changing rapidly, and I mean the number of new developments, high-rise towers all across Pyongyang, it would shock anyone who had been there 10 years ago. So go sooner rather than later. That's my advice, because I think it is in our lifetimes. It's really going to change a lot. And actually, it's the next heritage crisis. Whenever I meet anyone involved in UNESCO, I say you really need to be looking out for North Korea, because all of those interiors that I showed you from the 1950s and 60s with that kind of Soviet aesthetic of the terrazzo and the carved marble and the really kind of handcrafted decoration, that's being ripped out all across the city because it's not valued in North Korea. It's seen as this kind of symbol of a time when they were reliant on Soviet help. So it's a kind of embarrassment, and they're trying to get rid of it and replace it with these kind of Chinese imported materials. So yeah, North Korean heritage is the next global architectural crisis, I would say.
Hi, thanks for the fantastic talk. Just wondered about the sort of use of buildings and the reference maybe to other utopian schemes, whether, I don't know whether you can own your own house or flat, or whether it's allocated. Was there anything that you sort of understood about the way that the planning had structured the society and sort of allocated different areas to different uses and different sorts of workers? You talked about the apartments for artists, the apartments for professors. Just wanted you to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. As far as I understand it, the official line is that housing is still allocated by a working group. And so we were shown these new districts like Future Scientist Street and accommodation for academics at Kim Il-sung University. But what I understand from speaking to others South Korean architects who have contacts in the north, there's a kind of unofficial black market of trading housing, so swapping essentially. So they kind of meet, and then you can exchange under the radar. So there's nothing official about it. There's no kind of apartments advertised in the newspaper, but kind of through word of mouth and informal connections, we were told that people do actually kind of swap in that way. And now another researcher called Dong-woo Yim, who's based in Seoul, he's been doing a lot of research on how actually this kind of emerging middle class, they're called the donju, which the literal translation is masters of money. And so the donju are the ones who are kind of tacitly allowed to trade on the side. So it's the kind of emergence of a free market kind of under the radar. He was telling me that a lot of these kind of newly wealthy middle-class people are actually investing in development. And so some of these trophy projects that we see where the official line is this is all entirely funded and built by the state, he was saying actually there's a lot of these kind of middle-class investors who are putting money into these projects, which was news to me. And again, there's no kind of official literature about that because it's not the official kind of state-sponsored story. But I think under the radar, there is quite a lot of private development going on, small apartments that are kind of facilitated through essentially legalized bribery and having the right connections in the planning bureau. So I think there's a lot of that going on that is, to be honest, it's very difficult to quantify. But hopefully, I think that for part of this Seoul Architecture Biennale, there's going to be an exhibition about some of that, the kind of informal development that's happening from the bottom up. So it's, something on which we need more research. So anyone here who's looking for a good topic to investigate is something that needs probing.
Out of this one office only, you mentioned in the tower, there was a competition. You mentioned some...
Yeah, the Tower of the Juche idea.
So the competition was an open competition or a competition within the only office that exists?
Back then, it was when that building was built for Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday, so I think in the early 1980s. And it was a competition just amongst North Korean architects. So, I mean, the entry that was finally extruded into the Washington Monument came from one of the kind of state-sponsored North Korean architects. So it would have been an internal. I don't think they've ever had an open international competition, as far as I know, even for the Chongchun Sports Street, which is when they were trying to be as kind of outward-looking as possible. It was all done in-house by the North Koreans. There's apparently been some international kind of advice given on the level of engineering. So someone told me that the Mayday Stadium had German engineers consulting back then in the late 80s. But again, all of this stuff, the official line in all of the North Korean literature is that everything's only done by North Koreans. So even though some of them trained in Soviet Russia originally for those buildings of the early years. But yeah, there's never been an open competition. One day.
Again, thank you very much for your time. You mentioned the middle class and this middle class that is rising. Is it coming from outside Pyongyang or is it within the city? And then when you are traveling to the border, can you expand more upon what you see? What is the reality of these people? Are they going to the supermarket to buy their food, or what did you get to see?
Yeah, exactly. As far as I know, it's only in Pyongyang. So Pyongyang is the kind of showcase city where the elite are based. It has a similar system to China, where if you're born in a place, you can't move. Your kind of residency permit is tied to a particular area. So it's not like anyone can come to Pyongyang. So it remains a place for the kind of relative middle class or elite. In terms of how you can kind of see their presence visually, I suppose what was interesting to me was the number of these leisure facilities aimed at North Koreans. So when you hear about something like the horse riding center or the new multi-story spa complex, you think, oh yeah, this is built to show off to Western tourists. But it's not at all the case. These things are full of middle-class North Korean families. So the water park was heaving with North Koreans. There was a very expensive restaurant serving kind of hot pot and barbecue, which again was for the North Korean middle class. We passed Pyongyang's first coffee shop, where the waitresses had these touchscreen kind of iPad ordering devices, as you would find in a Western city. So these kinds of, it's basically places to spend your money. And I think Kim Jong-un, he's very clever. He's allowing just enough kind of opportunity for leisure and consumption to keep this newly moneyed class happy. So the department store now, there's a kind of massive range of cosmetics. And we went to the main department store, and again, it was like a scene from a second or third tier Chinese city, much better stocked than it would have been 10 years ago. Still no international products as far as we could tell. Still everything had the kind of official North Korean label. But yeah, cosmetics, fitted clothes, much more colorful clothes, the sunglasses, which I mentioned earlier, which are a fairly recent arrival. The presence of the car billboards has only just been in the last few years, because now car ownership is being allowed. So just a few little signs like that across the city. But I mean, we had no interaction with these people, so it was very difficult to get a kind of deeper sense of what the middle class, what they're doing and how they're spending their money.
I don't know if someone else has another question. I have one last question. Because you travel a lot and you write a lot about contemporary architecture. And you mentioned in the beginning the fascination of the strange worlds represented in the 2014 projects in the Venice Biennale. And after going to North Korea and to experience some of these candy architecture, how did that change your perspective, or how did you start to think differently about what's being built in London or in the US or in Berlin or wherever?
I don't think seeing what's happened in North Korea changed my perspective on what's happening elsewhere. I suppose it was more a surprise in terms of the kind of level of originality of some of the architecture. I suppose I was expecting it to feel, as I said at the beginning, I suppose the outsider's cliched stereotype of North Korea, so a kind of 1984 George Orwell world. I guess maybe I was expecting it to feel much more post-Soviet. If you've been to any of the post-Soviet capitals with these kind of wind-swept public spaces and quite kind of agoraphobia-inducing scale, which Pyongyang does have. It has these monumental boulevards terminating in statues of the leaders, so it does have that same feeling of alienation. But I think there's a level of kind of originality to some of the the kind of showcase buildings, particularly in the 1980s when Kim Jong-il was doing this drive for kind of experimental architecture and symbolic architecture. He particularly praised the maternity hospital, which is shaped like a mother embracing her baby. It has these kind of wings of wards coming out either side of the building. And in his treatise on architecture, he says how buildings should actually symbolically, there should be a didactic element to architectural representation here, where the building says what it does. And so things like the weightlifting arena designed like dumbbells, and the badminton arena with the arc of the flying shuttlecock. It's kind of Robert Venturi duck architecture at a similar time. This is, 10 years later. But he was aware, I think, of all of those things. And when you read the manifesto, you get a sense that maybe not him personally, but his assistants, whoever was writing this treatise on architecture, was well aware of what was going on in the outside world. So I think it's that level of kind of experimental, formal ingenuity that most surprised me. And I'm really intrigued to see what they do next. I mean, things like this underwater hotel and the new science center shaped like an atom with spinning electrons around the nucleus. There's some really wild stuff happening there. Anyone who's familiar with contemporary Chinese architecture, it's like that on steroids. Another question?
I'm wondering if you could tell us anything about the woman on the cover of your book.
Not much, apart from that she was one of the train guards. I can tell you an interesting story about the cover, which is that Taschen originally wanted to have the image of the entrance to the Grand People's Study House, so the statue of Kim Il-sung on his marble throne before the mosaic of Mount Pektu. The image, it was kind of halfway through the presentation. What they hadn't realized is that images of the leaders can't be used for promotional purposes. And so it's fine to have those images inside the book, but putting it on the cover would be a total heresy and could have probably got my guides put in jail, or they would have lost their jobs. And they, being Taschen, being a very large industrial scale production company, I only found out what the cover was going to be a few weeks before this book was going to press. So had some slightly hairy negotiations at the last minute to change the cover, and this was the replacement image. And I think it was chosen because it has the color, the kind of familiar color palette. This is, you can't really tell, but this is the pale green which recurs all around North Korea, and you get the other pastels in that image. But I'm afraid I don't know anything else about that lady in question.
So thank you, Oliver, to guide us through the unknown of North Korea. And thank you all for coming this afternoon, and see you next time, 21st.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.